The Caribbean, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the so-called Golden Age of piracies, a landscape colored by myth. We are taught to see swashbuckling heroes, charismatic captains like Captain Blackwood, sailing vibrant blue seas under the defiant flutter of the Jolly Roger, their chests bursting with plunder. These are the stories of escape, adventure, and boundless freedom. This narrative is a lie. For every romantic legend, there was the unwashed, brutal reality of the floating prison. This is the story of the average man who dared to take the king's shilling, or refuse it, and who found himself trapped in a cycle of desperation, disease, and inevitable betrayal. This is not a tale of glamour and gold. It is a meticulous, unflinching look at the gruesome cost of absolute freedom. From the agonizing squalor of the bilge decks and the merciless justice enforced by the lash and the saw, to the psychological toll of unrelenting paranoia among the crew. This is the history that tavern ballads omit. It is a world where an infected scratch meant a terrifying, agonizing death, where democracy was a guise for brutal economic control, and where every successful raid brought a man one step closer to the hangman's noose. Forget the silver screen. You wouldn't survive the historical reality of the pirate ship. This is the story of how men lived, suffered, and violently died in their desperate, filthy, and short-lived republic. The salt-cured wood of the sea serpent didn't smell of adventure. It smelled of stale sweat, unwashed bodies, and bilge water that had grown thick and black over months. For Elias Vance, 3 years removed from a life as a Bristol, the stench was the background score to his every waking moment, a constant, suffocating reminder that his great escape to piracy had only traded one kind of prison for another, a floating one. Elias was huddled in his hammock, a narrow strip of canvas strung barely a foot above the damp deck of the lower gun deck. Above him, another man, fat and prone to midnight coughing fits, swung gently, adding a rhythmic, sickly wheeze to the ship's symphony of misery. There was no privacy, ever. In the confines of the gun deck, the crew of 60 were packed together like salted cod. Every groan, every whispered complaint, every desperate scratch of lice-ridden skin was public domain. This forced intimacy bred tension, not camaraderie. A misplaced foot or a too loud snore could escalate into a knife fight over a square foot of air dot. The food was the first thing that stripped away the glamour. Forget roasted meats and tankards of ale. The staple was salmagundi, a vile concoction of shredded salted meat, hardtack biscuit fragments softened with water, and whatever vegetables hadn't rotted yet, usually onions or cabbage. But even this was a luxury compared to the constant threat of weevils. The biscuit, the infamous hardtack, was so infested that many crewmen simply ate it in the dark, preferring not to see the scurrying black specks that gave the rock-hard slabs a fleeting, unsettling crunch. Elias's biggest enemy, however, wasn't the British Navy. It was the water. Rations were strictly enforced, doled out by a gruff quartermaster who guarded the casks like a dragon. The water, stored in wooden barrels, went slimy and brackish within weeks. It grew a pale, unsettling moss inside the container, giving the precious liquid a taste that was metallic, sour, and faintly alive. To drink it was to risk the bow-wrenching agony of the flux, or the creeping, yellow dread of typhoid. Yet, to refuse was to die faster. Hygiene was a forgotten concept. A daily bath was the splash of spray over the bow, and a good scrub meant a rainstorm. Most of the crew hadn't seen a bar of soap in a year. The result was a constant plague of parasites. Lice were everywhere, in the beards, the hair, the seams of the rough linen shirts. When the itching became unbearable, Elias would join others in picking through his clothes, crushing the tiny black dots between his thumbnails with a grim, practiced efficiency. The darkness of the lower decks was another kind of oppression. Below the waterline, the sun was a rumor. Lamps were used sparingly due to the ever-present danger of fire, leaving the men to navigate by memory and touch. This perpetual gloom did more than just strain their eyes. It strained their minds. Weeks bled into months in the damp, shadowy heat, giving rise to wild superstitions, whispered paranoia, and the rapid spread of madness among the less resilient men. But the most insidious threat was the lack of vitamin C. Scurvy was the silent, terrifying executioner of the sea. Elias had watched Big Ben, the ship's usually jovial cook, slowly decay. First, his gums became spongy, bleeding with every hard piece of biscuit. Then, old scars that had healed years ago mysteriously reopened, weeping a watery blood. Finally, his legs swelled to twice their size, leaving him a moaning, immobile lump before he was quietly tossed overboard one foggy morning. Seeing Ben's demise served as a constant gnawing fear. They could capture all the treasure in the Caribbean, but if the captain didn't prioritize finding fresh citrus, every man was simply waiting for his gums to turn black. The romance of the pirate life, the freedom, the gold, the swagger, was a lie perpetuated by tavern ballads and dime novels written on dry land. The reality was a relentless cycle of hard labor, sickness, fear, and the omnipresent smell of decay. Elias would sometimes look out at the beautiful, endless blue horizon and realize the irony. They were free men, bound by no king or law, yet they were trapped in the most desolate, squalid cell imaginable, crewed by sick, desperate men, floating on the vast, indifferent ocean. The sea serpent wasn't a ship of fortune. It was a floating prison, and survival was the only prize. The day after Big Ben's body was slid into the sea, a silence thicker than the usual humid air settled over the sea serpent. Death was an inconvenience, not a tragedy, but it served as a potent, if temporary, reminder of the only true constitution that governed them, the Articles. Captain Blackwood didn't rule through charisma. He ruled through the fear inspired by a thin, tightly scribed document, the Articles of the Sea Serpent. These weren't idealistic notions of brotherhood. They were brutal bylaws, a social contract signed in desperation and enforced by the lash and the pistol. For Elias Vance, the Articles represented the only stability in the chaos of pirate life, and the only proof that their republic had any structure at all. Every new recruit, often a reluctant sailor forced into service, was made to sign or mark the parchment. Article 1, the most sacred, demanded every man's life, without reservation, in the pursuit of plunder. But it was Article 4 that governed their daily bread and their dreams, the division of the spoil. The captain and quartermaster, as elected leaders, received 2 shares. The officers, the boatswain, the master gunner, and the sailing master received 1.5. Every ordinary seaman, Elias included, received a single, solitary share. It sounds fair, doesn't it? Elias overheard the old, cynical gunner, Silas, rasping to a new, starry-eyed recruit. A share for a share of the risk. But see how the gold shrinks. Silas was right. The brutal economy of piracy ensured that very little gold ever made it past the initial split. First, they had to deduct for the maintenance of the state, repairs to the ship, new ropes, powder, and shot. Then came the compensation clause. A pirate was not an employee. He was a shareholder who bore the full cost of his injuries. Lose an arm or a leg in a fight. The articles promised you 600 pieces of 8. Lose an eye. 100 pieces. It sounded generous until you watched a man try to buy a future with a few hundred coins, unable to work the lines or load a cannon. These payments were deducted before the general split, eating into the total haul. The true cruelty lay in the enforcement of the laws. While the articles provided a framework for shared governance, the crew could, in theory, vote to depose a captain. The day-to-day discipline was merciless. Article V was the most feared. No desertion, no cowardice. On a raid 3 months prior, a Frenchman named Luc had frozen at the moment of boarding, paralyzed by the sight of blood. He hadn't run, but he hadn't fought. Under the articles, this was an act of treason against the Republic. Blackwood, without a moment's hesitation, had ordered Lutz's nose and ears slit with a razor, then left him on a barren rock to be collected by a passing merchant ship, a grim warning to any who might think of opposing them. Lutz's punishment wasn't about vengeance. It was about maintaining the absolute, terrifying cohesion required to win a fight. Their success depended on every man being willing to die. The system was also designed to crush individual enterprise. Article V strictly forbade hoarding or unauthorized trading. Any man caught concealing a jewel, a fine piece of silk, or even a silver button anything that hadn't been declared to the quartermaster, faced the most immediate and final penalty. Elias had seen the quartermaster hang a man named Thomas right from the main yardarm simply for trying to sneak a dozen bars of chocolate out of the plunder. The message was clear. Your life belonged to the articles, and your possessions belonged to the collective. This structure of iron discipline and brutal economics ensured that, even after a successful haul, the average pirate walked away with far less than the legends suggested. Much of the wealth was paid out in perishable goods, cheap liquor, or necessary supplies. The real, portable gold and jewels were quickly squandered in the debauched ports of Kaltortuga, Nassau, or Port Royal on gambling, women, and cheap drink, only to leave the crew penniless and desperate enough to set sail again, chasing the next myth of easy riches. Elias clutched the single, worn shilling he had managed to keep hidden in the sole of his boot, a personal, undeclared reserve, a dangerous defiance of Article V. The articles, he thought bitterly, didn't create a republic of free men. They created a perpetual cycle of violence and debt. They were the perfect economic machine for maritime criminals, a system that efficiently processed human desperation into naval plunder, ensuring that the only way to earn a livelihood was to risk losing your life, piece by piece, until the noose or the sea finally claimed the full, single share they'd been promised. The true treasure wasn't gold. It was the ability to survive the laws they themselves had sworn to uphold. The moment the smoke cleared after a successful, if bloody, raid on a small Spanish sloop, the Sea Serpent transformed. It was no longer a vessel of plunder. It became a makeshift infirmary and, more often than not, a charnel house. The air, thick with the smell of spent gunpowder and salt, soon acquired the coppery stench of fresh blood, quickly followed by the sickeningly sweet, heavy odor of old, festering pus. Elias Vance stood by the railing, not with the pride of victory, but with the cold dread of a man who knew the true cost of their success. They had taken little gold, but the skirmish had left 5 men wounded, and young Thomas, barely 18, was the worst off. A musket ball had shattered his left forearm. The injury wasn't immediately fatal, which, in the brutal economy of the pirate life, was arguably the crueler fate. There was no actual surgeon on a pirate ship. The articles promised a doctor's share to the man who provided medical care, but that man was often Silas, the quartermaster. Silas had once been a butcher on land trade that gave him a dangerous combination of familiarity with cutting flesh and total ignorance of human anatomy. He was known for two medical instruments, a dull, rusted saw designed for cutting spars, now reserved for bones, and a scorching iron, his tool for cauterizing. "Get the rum down his throat," Silas barked, his face set in a grim mask of duty. The anesthetic was half a bottle of watery, cheap rum forced down Thomas's throat until the boy was sputtering and choking. The pain would remain, but the rum would hopefully dull the screams that could demobilize the rest of the crew. Silas knelt, examining the mangled arm. Bones, powder, infections already setting in from the wadding. He didn't bother to clean the wound. His diagnosis was swift, his solution singular. Amputation. Elias was ordered to hold the boy's shoulders. Thomas's eyes, wide with sheer, incomprehensible terror, locked onto Elias. A silent plea for mercy that Elias could not give. Silas wrapped a dirty leather belt around the arm, high up near the shoulder, pulling it tight to stem the flow. The saw came out, a saw designed for wood. The screeching sound it made as it tore through Thomas's flesh and scraped against the splintered bone was inhuman. Thomas's scream wasn't dulled by the rum. It was amplified by pure animal agony, a sound that cut through the humid air like a physical blade. It wasn't quick. It took Silas nearly 2 full minutes to sever the limb, the sweat pouring off his brow as he sawed through the resistant tissues. When it was done, the severed arm, still twitching slightly, was tossed into a bucket of slop. Silas grabbed the glowing poker from the forger, hissing, wicked reddened, pressed it directly onto the raw stump. The smell was instant and horrifying, burnt sugar and burnt meat. The aim was to seal the arteries. But what it mostly did was ensure the man's suffering was complete. Thomas didn't survive the night. The amputation hadn't killed him. The immediate and raging infection of the wound had. But the immediate trauma was one thing. Elias knew the slow killers were far more reliable. Every pirate lived under the shadow of typhus, spread by the ubiquitous lice and the filth of the crowded decks. A fever that started slow would consume a man in days, leaving him babbling incoherently before he slipped into a coma. There were no effective medicines, no clean water for compresses, and absolutely no quarantines. The only intervention was the crew's prayer that the ship's master would have enough sense to isolate the sick man before the fever took root in the pact. Decks below, and then there was the scurvy. The disease Elias had watched claim Big Ben. It wasn't a quick death. It was a physical dismantling, a deep, aching weariness that no amount of sleep could fix. The slow retreat of the gums, turning the mouth into a festering, black ruin. The pirate life promised a world of gold, but the brutal reality was that their bodies were starved of a single, nutrient vitamin C, a tiny defense against the elements that the sea, their very home, cruelly denied them. Elias looked at the empty hammock where Thomas had slept hours before, now already taken by another man eager for the space. The lack of medical care wasn't a failure of ingenuity. It was a core component of the pirate existence. They were disposable, and they knew it. A pirate's career, if not ended by a cannonball or the hangman's rope, was almost certainly terminated by a tiny cut turning into raging gangrene, a mild fever blooming into a fatal plague, or the slow, skeletal decay of scurvy. The sea was vast and merciless, but it was the pirate ship itself, the damp, crowded, disease-ridden coffin they called home, that truly offered the pirate's grave. They sailed under the black flag, but they lived under the grim shadow of the red, oozing infection that waited for every single scratch and scrape. Elias touched the fading scar on his own cheek. He knew, with absolute certainty, that one day his luck would run out, and his single, small wound would be greeted not by a doctor, but by the butcher's saw and the indifferent sea. The rule of the articles was the rule of instant, visceral fear. There were no courts, no juries, and no appeals. Justice aboard the Sea Serpent was dispensed at the moment of transgression, and it was always delivered by the quartermaster. Silas, the man who knew how to cut both flesh and bone. The most common penalty, the brutal maintenance of order, was flogging. It was a punishment Elias had witnessed countless times, yet the sight never failed to curdle the blood in his veins. The victim was usually a man caught drunk on watch, or sleeping through a change of cell transgressions that didn't just break a rule, but risked the lives of every soul aboard. The condemned would be stripped to the waist and lashed firmly to the rigging of the mainmast, their arms stretched high above their heads in a posture of helpless vulnerability. The ritual was deliberate, public, and designed to maximize terror. On this particular morning, the guilty party was Finn, a burly Irish lad who had lost 2 hours of crucial steering time while passed out from smuggled rum. The crew was gathered, silent. Captain Blackwood stood on the quarterdeck, silent and impassive, leaving the dirty work to his deputy. Silas, moving with the practiced efficiency of an executioner, unwound the cat o'-nine-tails, 9 separate strands of rope, each knotted fiercely at the tips. The knots, Silas once bragged, were harder than the wood they were used on. 10 lashes for gross negligence and risk to all. Silas roared, his voice cutting through the morning calm. The first blow landed with a sickening thwack. It wasn't the sound that terrified Elias. It was the immediate, violent welt that appeared across Finn's shoulder blades, splitting the skin and drawing a bead of blood that traced the line of the knots. The subsequent blows were delivered with rhythmic, brutal precision. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Each stroke elicited a fresh, guttural cry from Finn, starting as a yelp and devolving into a choked, whimpering moan. The punishment wasn't administered until the pain became unbearable. It was administered until the body began to fail. Elias watched, his jaw tight, as Finn's back transformed into a mess of crisscrossing, crimson welts. The blood pooled at the base of the mast, joining the rank bilge water. By the 6th stroke, Finn's cries had stopped, replaced by shallow, involuntary gasps. By the 10th, he collapsed heavily against the rigging ropes, barely conscious. The lesson was delivered not just to Finn, but to every pair of eyes watching. The pirate's life was free, but the cost of that freedom was absolute obedience to the articles, enforced by a pain no man could endure silently. But flogging, Elias knew, was only the appetizer for the crimes of profound betrayal, stealing from the common chest, attempting to incite a mutiny, or worse, abandoning the crew during a fight. There was the punishment that was steeped in folklore and fear. Marooning. The terror of marooning was its slow-motion finality. It wasn't murder. It was an act of severance, separating the traitor from the only society that would tolerate him and letting nature deliver the final sentence. 2 years ago, a man named Jacques had been caught trying to steal a handful of diamonds before they were declared to the quartermaster. Blackwood deemed the offense a betrayal of the entire Republic. The crew lowered a longboat. Jacques was rowed, not to the nearest port, but to a tiny, arid sand cay, barely visible above the waves, a low, scrubby patch of rock outside the usual shipping lanes. The ceremonial objects of his demise were placed beside him. First, a tattered blanket. Second, a single bottle of brackish water enough for a day, perhaps two. Third, and most cruelly, a rusty old pistol, placed with a small amount of powder and a single lead ball. The pistol was not a tool for self-defense. It was a promise. It offered the condemned man a choice: fight the inevitable elements, or take the final, immediate exit. Elias had been one of the oarsmen on that longboat. He remembered Jacques' face as the pirate ship began to shrink on the horizon. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was pure, unadulterated panic. The realization that his entire existence had been reduced to a sun-baked rock and a mouthful of water. The pirate, who had lived by his freedom, was now utterly alone, hopelessly alone. As the sea serpent sailed away, a single, sharp crack echoed faintly across the water. Jacques had made his choice. Elias straightened, running a hand over the clammy deck where Finn's blood was still drying. The discipline was brutal, yes, but it was effective. It kept the ships running, the cannons firing, and the men in line. They were freebooters, but they were bound by the most absolute law of the sea: obeyed the articles, or face the torment. And the torment always ended the same way, by the quick violence of the lash, or the slow, agonizing solitude of the grave that awaited on that barren, unforgiving sand. The tales of buccaneers never spoke of They didn't mention the agonizing monotony of patching sails, or the sheer, miserable exhaustion of scraping barnacles from the hull in a blistering sun. Elias Vance quickly learned that the real enemy of the pirate was not the Spanish Main or the King's Navy. It was the sea itself, a persistent, tireless force dedicated to rotting their wooden coffin from the inside out between the rare, expulsive moments of a raid. Piracy was defined by an endless, grinding work. The sea serpent, old and heavily burdened by years of neglect and cannon fire, demanded constant, brutal attention. The primary chore was the bilge, the lowest part of the ship where all the refuse, rainwater, and inevitable leaks collected. The pump was heavy, demanding, and constant. You stop pumping, we sink. Simple as that. Quartermaster Silas had declared on Elias's first day. The work was relentless. 2 hours on, 4 hours off, 24 hours a day. The pump handle was always slick with sweat and brine, and the water it brought up smelled of decay, oil, and human waste. Elias's muscles perpetually ached. His hands, despite the thick calluses, were permanently raw and blistered, perpetually smelling of the foul bilge water. When he lay down in his hammock, the rhythmic squeak of the pump was the last sound he heard, and the first to wake him. But bilge pumping was only the base requirement of survival. The salt air and sun were corrosive. Every morning meant inspecting the ropes, tarring the rigging, and checking the seams. The canvas sails were constantly tearing under the stress of rapid maneuvers, and Elias, often forced high into the raft, would spend hours sewing heavy, wet canvas with coarse needles, praying a sudden swell wouldn't send him plummeting to the deck. One day blurred into the next, marked not by plunder, but by the relentless rhythm of the ship's maintenance. sleep was a luxury snatched in brief, miserable intervals. Elias developed the ability to sleep standing up, leaning against a mast or a gun carriage, only to be violently roused by the boatswain's pipe for the next urgent task. They were men fleeing servitude, only to become slaves to the unforgiving physics of sailing. The true test of their relentless labor came with the arrival of a tropical storm. It began with a sudden, eerie calm. The air grew heavy, the sky turning a bruised, violent purple. Then, the sea simply erupted. Within minutes, the sea serpent was engulfed in a deafening, terrifying maelstrom. Captain Blackwood's orders were a hoarse shout against the wind: secure. Furl the mainsail. Down to the bare poles. Elias and 5 other men scrambled up the slick whipping ropes of the foremast. The wind was a physical force, a monstrous hand trying to tear them from their precarious perch. Rain lashed their faces, cold and stinging, reducing visibility to 0. The mast itself, a seemingly solid pillar of wood, groaned and swayed violently. The entire structure of the ship protesting its ordeal. Their job was to claw their way out onto the yardarm and subdue the heavy, thrashing canvas to tie it down so the wind couldn't rip it to shreds, taking the mast with it. A single snap of a rope could send the whole assembly crashing down, instantly crippling and likely sinking the ship. Elias clung to the yardarm like a drowning man, his body horizontal against the wind, the sea beneath him a terrifying, mountainous black chaos. He could barely feel his fingers, raw from gripping the wet, tearing canvas. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. For 12 agonizing hours, they battled. They were frozen, soaked, bruised by flying debris, and utterly exhausted. The only thing that kept them moving was the primal knowledge that if they stopped, if they gave in to the exhaustion, they would die. The ship would founder, and their bodies would be sucked down into the churning abyss. When the storm finally passed, as abruptly as it had begun, Elias slid down the rigging, collapsing onto the waterlogged deck. He lay there for a long time, too tired to move, watching the watery sunrise paint the exhausted wreckage of the ship. They had survived, but survival simply meant beginning the maintenance all over again, repairing snapped lines, patching holes, and endlessly pumping the bilge. There was no rest for the wicked, because the wicked dared to challenge the one authority greater than the king's navy or the articles, the overwhelming, ceaseless power of the ocean. Elias knew that they hadn't defeated the storm. They had merely earned a brief, miserable reprieve until the next one arrived, or until their constant, back-breaking labor finally failed them. For Elias Vance, the worst part of piracy wasn't the constant hunger, the gnawing sickness, or the brutal work. It was the knowledge. It was the absolute, crushing certainty that his life would not end quietly in a hammock or violently in a storm, but publicly at the end of a rope, swaying like a scarecrow in the Caribbean sun. Every man on the Sea Serpent knew their career had 2 possible endings: a sudden death in battle, or the hangman's noose. The career of a pirate was brutally short. The romantic legends spoke of decades of plunder, but the reality was that most privateering crews turned pirate lasted barely 2 years before they were either destroyed in battle or hunted down by colonial authorities. The Crown, particularly the British, didn't view piracy as a criminal nuisance. They saw it as a profound threat to maritime commerce. And their response was always the same: spectacle. The news of the kings. Proclamation of general pardon offered to any pirate who, surrendered by a certain date, had caused a fissure aboard the Sea Serpent. A few, broken by the endless toil, had spoken of turning themselves in, hoping to trade the hangman for forced labor. Don't be a fool. Lads, Captain Blackwood had sneered, his eyes glittering with ruthless experience. They forgive the crime. They don't forgive the pirate. You think Governor Rogers is going to let 100 men who know every inlet and every secret sail away with a pardon? No, he'll take your names, wait a year, and when you slip up cutting lumber or hauling sugar, he'll find a witness to swear you stole a button, and you'll hang just the same. Blackwood's skepticism was a bitter truth. Elias remembered the fate of the infamous Captain Stede Bonnet, a gentleman turned pirate. Bonnet had surrendered, sought pardon, and tried to resume an honest life. It mattered little. The authorities, needing to establish control and terror, ensured Bonnet was hanged in Charleston, his execution drawing a massive crowd, a deliberate demonstration of the Crown's unwavering reach. The executions were always public, staged in busy ports like Port Royal or Nassau. They were not swift affairs hidden behind prison walls. They were gallows theater. The victims were often paraded through the town's most populated streets, sometimes forced to wear their outlandish pirate attire, a grotesque final performance for the crowd. The message was explicitly aimed at the local populace, the desperate dock workers, and the merchant sailors who might be tempted to turn rogue. This is what happens when you threaten the structure of trade. Elias had, years ago, witnessed such an event from a concealed position in a port tavern, a sight that haunted his dreams more than any storm. The condemned man, usually a crewmate from a captured vessel, stood on a low cart beneath the freshly erected wooden gallows. The crowd was a dense, silent mass, some gleeful, some morbidly curious, and many simply afraid. The local chaplain delivered a long, droning sermon about sin and redemption, which no one truly heard. The moment of the hanging was always agonizingly slow. The hangman, often an elderly, clumsy functionary, would place the coarse hemp noose around the pirate's neck. Unlike the smooth, quick drops practiced today, these were often clumsy, imperfect executions. The knot would be poorly positioned, or the drop insufficient. The result was not a broken neck and instant death, but a slow, horrific strangulation. The pirate would thrash and struggle against the rope, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging as he fought for air against the unyielding hemp. This spectacle of protracted suffering was the point, a final, terrifying deterrent for the onlookers after the hanging. The authorities often took the extra, cruel step of giving the bodies of the most notorious pirates, the captains and officers, were soaked in tar, encased in iron cages, the gibbets, and hoisted up high on spits of land or at the entrance to the harbor. These skeletal, swaying figures, picked clean by birds and bleached by the sun, served as navigational markers and permanent, silent warnings for all incoming and outgoing ships. Elias knew the odds. He wasn't a hero. He was a statistic. His name, if he were ever captured, would become a footnote in a governor's ledger, and his body a component of the Crown's terrifying public education program. As the sea serpent slipped through the night, running dark and fast from a perceived naval threat, Elias lay awake. He wasn't thinking about the next prize, or even the next meal. He was thinking about the scratchy feel of a rough hemp rope, the sound of the crowd, and the absolute finality of the hangman's knot. The freedom the pirates cherished was ultimately just a temporary lease on life, a wild, violent burst of existence that was destined to end precisely where the rule of law intended it to, dangling high above the sea. a feast for the circling vultures, and a warning to the world. The moment the anchor dropped in Nassau Harbor, the discipline forged by the quartermaster's lash dissolved into a feverish, desperate chaos. After months of rancid water, weevil-ridden, and the brutal grind of the sea, the promise of land of solid ground, women, and cheap, intoxicating liquor drove the crew of the Sea Serpent into a frenzy. This was the pirate's reward, the brief, violent explosion of debauchery that justified all the misery at sea. But as Elias Vance knew, the port was often more dangerous than any storm. The air in the taverns of Nassau didn't smell like the sea. It smelled like cheap molasses rum, stale tobacco smoke, and unwashed crowds. This temporary pirate republic, built on sand and liquor, was a gauntlet of pitfalls where the pirates accumulated. Wealth disappeared faster than water poured onto hot coals. Elias had managed to keep his few pieces of eight safe from the quartermaster, but protecting them from the human vultures of the port was a different matter. The first threat was the rum. After weeks of enforced sobriety, the liquor hit hard and fast. It wasn't the refined spirits of London. It was fiery, raw cane molasses, often cut with dubious water, or worse, and designed to strip a man of his sense and his shillings within hours. Men drank until they were incoherent, collapsing into pools of their own filth. Easy prey for the predatory locals, but the biggest drain on their meager spoils was the gambling. Every tavern had its tables, packed with sailors, prostitutes, and professional sharps who waited like spiders for the drunken, cash-rich crew. Dice, cards, and rigged shell games stripped men of their shares faster than any customs officer. Elias watched as 2 months of hard-won, blood-soaked prize money vanished from the hands of poor O'Malley in less than an hour, lost to a deck of marked cards run by a toothless proprietor. O'Malley, now broke and weeping with drunken rage, had to face the inevitable consequence, signing on for another 6 months of misery just to survive. Then came the women. The ports were filled with those who saw a pirate not as a man, but as a walking coin purse. They were often desperate souls themselves, but they were ruthlessly efficient at separating the seamen from their wealth. Elias had heard the stories countless times, a night of passion paid for with a pirate's entire share, only to wake up alone in an alley, his pockets empty and his head pounding. Worse than the financial ruin was the disease, the cramped, filthy conditions of the ports, the communal bedding. The unsanitary taverns were breeding grounds for every imaginable contagion. After the cold dread of scurvy at sea, the fear on land shifted to the fiery, agonizing dread of venereal disease. Syphilis and gonorrhea were rampant, whispered about in hushed, fearful tones. There were no cures, only quacks and poisonous mercury treatments that often left the victim worse off than the disease itself. A man could survive cannon fire and the lash, only to contract an invisible ailment on one night of drunken carelessness that would leave him crippled, blind, or dead within the year. The price of pleasure was often a slow, agonizing demise. Elias walked through the crowded streets with a perpetual knot in his stomach. The chaos was exhilarating for a few hours, a release of tension that bordered on madness, but it always ended in regret. He saw men who had survived battles that wiped out half the crew now lying in the gutters, stripped clean by thieves, shaking with fever. Their brief freedom squandered entirely. The cycle was cruelly efficient. Plunder, hard work, and extreme risk yields a small profit. Port, the profit is immediately lost to drink. Gambling and vice, disease, the man is left sick and penniless. Desperation, broke, sick, and dependent on the captain, the pirate is forced back to sea to start the cycle again. hoping to earn enough to simply survive the next few months until the next port for Elias. The taverns represented the ultimate mockery of the pirate life. They sought freedom from authority and wealth from the sea, yet they were utterly unable to govern their own desires on land. Their brief, brutal freedom was entirely illusory. The colonial governors didn't need to send ships to destroy them. They simply needed to leave the taverns open and the rum flowing, staring at a drunken brawl erupting near a gaming table. Elias realized the deepest truth of their existence. They were trapped in a self-perpetuating, brutal loop. The dangers of the port, the dissipation, the debt, the disease were just as certain, and often more final, than the gallows they desperately tried to outrun. The price of a night of forgetfulness was the guaranteed return to the squalor of the sea serpent, and the eventual certainty of the pirate's grave. After the brief, ruinous reprieve on shore, the sea serpent sailed with a fresh, toxic load of fear. The physical ailments, scurvy, typhus, and venereal disease were easy to identify. Far more insidious, however, were the invisible plagues carried within the minds of the men: distrust, paranoia, and the complete absence of loyalty. These were the true psychological chains of the pirate's life. In the Royal Navy, loyalty was enforced by king and country. In the Pirate Republic, the only binding force was mutual self-interest, and that bond was as thin and brittle as old canvas. Every man on board was, at one time or another, a deserter, a criminal, or a turncoat. They all knew the price of betrayal, because every one of them was capable of it. For Elias Vance, the constant mental toll was exhausting. He had learned the hard way that friendship was a liability. A close confidant could, at any moment, become a competitor for the last piece of decent meat, a witness to a crime, or, worst of all, an informant looking to bargain his life away. The core of the paranoia lay in the Article's power structure. While the crew could vote, the captain and the quartermaster Blackwood and Silas were often in silent, ruthless competition. Blackwood needed Silas to enforce discipline and manage the spoils. But Silas was the official representative of the crew and, crucially, the man with the power to depose the captain. Elias watched their interactions like a hawk. A misplaced glance, a shared, silent joke, or a sudden change in command could signal a shift in power. If Blackwood ever appeared weak, Silas would move. If Silas ever seemed too popular, Blackwood would find a reason to punish him publicly. Survival meant aligning yourself with the winning side, but identifying the winner before the blood was spilled was a high-stakes gamble. This internal warfare bled down to the ordinary seaman. No man slept soundly. The common anxiety wasn't the sound of enemy cannon. It was the whisper in the dark, the hand reaching for a pistol, or the suspicion that a crewmate was hoarding gold. The punishment for theft from a shipmate was severe, but the punishment for merely suspecting theft was a sleepless night spent with a hand resting on a knife, waiting for a shadow to move. "Keep your eyes on the deck," an old pirate once advised Elias. "Not for the enemy, for your mates. The enemy will give you an honest fight. Your mates will stab you while you sleep and call it justice." The greatest source of paranoia was the constant awareness of the bounty. Every port had posters detailing the rewards for Blackwood, Silas, and the whole crew. When a ship was taken, the merchant crew was often offered a choice: join the pirates or be marooned. But a third, more subtle choice always hovered: inform. Any captured sailor who turned out to be a crown agent, or who decided the reward money was worth the risk, was a ticking clock. Elias began to develop a habit he couldn't break. He never stood with his back to the cabin door, and he never drank rum poured by another man. He would inspect his hammock ropes nightly, fearing sabotage. His mind, once focused on simple survival and plunder, was now a complex web of suspicion and defense mechanisms. The freedom they sought was replaced by a psychological cage of their own making. The lack of loyalty was most cruelly exposed during the moments of failure. When a prize was lost or a storm damaged the ship, the crew immediately turned on itself. The communal blame was toxic. Men who had just fought side by side to repel a raid would suddenly accuse each other of incompetence, cowardice, or bad luck, with the goal of pushing the blame and thus the punishment onto the weakest link. The pirate republic was a democracy built on the swift, self-serving betrayal of its own citizens. The mental exhaustion was perhaps the ultimate price. A pirate could be perpetually sick, constantly hungry, and always one step from the gallows, but he could not afford to be tired. Mental fatigue led to mistakes, falling asleep on watch, misinterpreting a threat, or, fatalistically, believing a promise of loyalty. Elias knew the story would end one of two ways. Either the crown would catch him, or his own mind would break. He gripped the edge of his hammock, the constant creak and sway of the ship, a maddening reminder that the one place he needed safety in the trust of his shipmates was the one place he would never find it. He was surrounded by men who were also terrified, men whose survival instinct was just as keen, and who would, without a second thought, trade his life for a clean escape or an extra share of gold. The psychology of survival among pirates was not about courage. It was about solipsism. It was a life lived entirely for the self, where every action, every whispered word, and every shared laugh was filtered through a single, paranoid question. What does this man want from me, and how will he use it to survive? It was the ultimate, horrible solitude in a crowd of the desperate, and it was the deepest, darkest truth of the pirate's existence.